I should have known better than to go up there alone. It had been years since I last stayed at the old family cabin, a two-room structure deep in the woods, built decades ago by my grandfather. It wasn't anything special, a wooden frame, a tin roof, and a stone fireplace, but it held memories, good ones, or at least they used to be. I told myself that's why I was going, to reconnect with something simpler. No cell service, no electricity, just me, the trees, and the quiet. But maybe I was lying to myself. Maybe I just wanted to prove that I could still do it. The road leading up was a mess of potholes and overgrown branches. I had to park the truck half a mile down the trail because a fallen tree blocked the path. By the time I hauled my gear up the last stretch, sweat soaked through my shirt. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles. It was quiet, too quiet. I had expected to hear birds or the rustling of small animals, but the only sounds came from my own movements. The cabin looked the same, though the wood had darkened with time. The porch creaked under my boots as I tested the planks. Still sturdy, I unlocked the door and shoved it open, the musty air hitting me instantly. It smelled of old wood, dust, and something else. Something faint but sour. Probably an animal had gotten in at some point. I checked the corners for signs of rodents or raccoons, but everything seemed undisturbed. I set down my gear, opened the windows to let in fresh air, and got to work. First was checking the food supplies I had brought. Canned goods, some jerky, dried fruit. Then the firewood. There was still a neat pile stacked against the back wall. I built a small fire to cut the dampness and let it burn low while I walked the perimeter of the property. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, thick with old growth, dense with brush. No trails, no signs of recent human activity. That should have been comforting. It wasn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned back toward the cabin, my stomach tight. That night I woke to a sound. A snap, sharp and deliberate, somewhere outside. I lay still, ears straining, but the forest had gone silent again. No wind, no crickets, just that thick, heavy quiet. I reached for my flashlight, my hand stiff with unease, and clicked it on. The beam hit the walls, the floor, the single window facing the woods. Nothing. I stayed awake for hours, listening. Nothing came. The fire had burned down to embers by then, and exhaustion finally took over. The next morning, I found tracks in the soft dirt near the cabin. Not animal tracks, footprints, barefoot, the size of an adult's foot, but distorted, as if whoever left them had moved strangely, dragging or limping. They led from the tree line, circled the cabin once, then disappeared back into the woods. I told myself it was a trick of the light, shadows, maybe even my own footprints from yesterday. But I knew that wasn't true. I spent the day gathering firewood, stacking it inside instead of leaving it out back. I double-checked the locks on the door and windows, though I knew a determined person or thing could break through if they really wanted to. The feeling of being watched never left me. It stayed, a weight pressing against my skin, making every movement feel sluggish and unnatural. That night, I barely slept. I kept the fire going. Every now and then, I thought I heard something just beyond the window. Movement, breathing. But when I shined the flashlight outside, the woods looked empty. On the third night, the knocking started. Soft at first, a deliberate tap, tap, tap against the cabin wall. I froze. It wasn't a branch scraping in the wind. It wasn't an animal nosing around. It was deliberate, human. I held my breath, heart hammering. The knocking stopped. Minutes passed. Then it came again, this time against the window. A soft, almost curious sound, like fingers testing the glass. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Whoever or whatever it was, they knew I was inside. They were waiting, watching. The next knock was louder, more forceful. Then came another and another, a slow, rhythmic pattern moving along the cabin wall. I gripped the flashlight, flicking it on and shining it at the window. Nothing was there. The knocking stopped. I barely slept that night. I kept the hatchet by my bedroll, the fire stoked high. The air inside felt heavy, thick with something unseen but real, something I could feel pressing in around me. At dawn, I packed my gear. I didn't care if it was early. I didn't care if I had planned to stay longer. I wasn't staying another night. As I stepped onto the porch, I stopped cold. More footprints. This time, they weren't just circling the cabin. They were everywhere, leading to the door, the windows, the firewood pile. Some were pressed so deep into the earth, I knew whoever made them had stood there for a long time, just waiting. I didn't waste another second. I grabbed my pack and started down the trail. My heart pounded with every step, expecting at any moment to hear something behind me. I didn't look back. When I reached my truck, I threw everything in the back and sped off down the dirt road, bouncing over potholes, snapping branches as I went. I didn't slow down until I reached the main road, miles away. Only then did I risk a glance in the rearview mirror. The road behind me was empty, just trees and dust. No movement, no figures standing at the edge of the woods. But I knew better. I never went back to that cabin, never told anyone what happened. But sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I can still hear that slow, deliberate knocking. I arrived at the cabin just before dusk. The drive had been long and lonely, winding up dirt roads that barely looked maintained. My GPS had lost signal hours ago, and I had been relying on a printed map, one of those cheap gas station ones with barely any detail. The rental listing described the place as a rustic retreat in the mountains, perfect for solitude. That was what I wanted, just a few days alone, away from everything. No work, no emails, no people, just quiet. The cabin was smaller than I expected. A single-story structure with a steeply slanted roof, weathered wooden walls, and a sagging front porch. There was no driveway, just a patch of dirt where previous guests must have parked. I killed the engine and stepped out, stretching my legs. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, a crispness that only came with high-altitude forests. There were no other buildings in sight, just thick trees pressing in from all sides. Inside, the cabin was basic. A main room with a wood stove, a small kitchen tucked into one corner, and a single bedroom in the back. The floors creaked under my boots, and the air had that stale, closed-up smell of a place that hadn't been lived in for a while. A stack of firewood sat near the stove, and the kitchen had a few mismatched dishes in the cabinets. Enough to get by for a few days. After unpacking my bags, I checked my phone. No signal. Not surprising. The listing had warned about that. Still, it made me uneasy. The thought of being completely cut off. I shook it off. This was what I wanted, peace. No distractions. I lit the wood stove, boiled some water for coffee, and settled in with a book as the night closed in around the cabin. The first strange thing happened around midnight. I had just turned off the lantern and crawled into bed when I heard it. Footsteps. Not the rustling of an animal in the underbrush, but slow, deliberate steps on the porch. Heavy, measured. My first thought was a bear, maybe even a moose. I held still, listening. The steps stopped right outside the door. I waited, my heart pounding, but there was nothing. No snuffling, no scratching, no attempt to push the door open. Just silence. After a long minute, I convinced myself I was imagining things. The woods played tricks on people at night. Sounds carried strangely. I tried to sleep, but I kept jolting awake, ears straining for any noise. If there was something out there, it never made another sound. In the morning, I stepped outside, expecting to see animal tracks in the dirt. There was nothing. The ground was undisturbed. No paw prints, no sign of movement. Just my own footprints from the night before. I checked around the cabin, searching for anything that might explain what I had heard. Nothing. The second night was worse. The footsteps returned, but this time, they circled the cabin. Slow, deliberate, crunching over the pine needles and dried leaves. I sat up in bed, gripping my flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. I was too afraid of what I might see if I did. My breathing was too loud, my pulse hammering in my ears. The steps circled once, twice, then stopped. Minutes passed. Then came a sound that made my stomach drop. The creak of the porch boards, the unmistakable shift of weight. Something was standing right outside the door again. I barely slept. First light, I checked again. The dirt was undisturbed. No prints, no marks. It was as if nothing had ever been there. But I knew what I had heard. I told myself I was being paranoid. I tried to enjoy the day. I hiked a little, stayed close to the cabin. By evening, I had almost convinced myself it had been my imagination. Until I found the knife. It wasn't mine. It was old. The wooden handle worn smooth from years of use. The blade was rusted, pitted with age, and it was stuck into the porch railing, driven deep into the wood. My stomach churned. Someone had been here. Someone had done this while I slept. I grabbed my keys, my bag, everything important, and threw it into the car. I didn't care if I had paid for another 2 nights. I wasn't staying. But when I turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. The engine didn't even try to turn over. Dead. Panic set in. I was stranded. No cell service. No way to call for help. No one knew exactly where I was. I spent the next hour trying to get the car to start. Checking the battery, jiggling the cables, doing everything I knew how to do. Nothing worked. The sun was sinking. I was running out of time. I had to make a choice. Stay in the cabin for another night or start walking. The nearest town was at least 15 miles away. Maybe more. The thought of being out in the woods at night, alone, terrified me. But the thought of staying here, waiting for whatever was out there to come back, was worse. I packed my bag with essentials. A flashlight, a knife, some food, and a bottle of water. I locked the cabin door behind me, as if that would help. Then I started walking. The first mile was fine. The road was rough, but the moon was bright enough to see by. The trees crowded in, branches scraping together in the breeze. Every sound made me jump. I forced myself to keep moving. Then I heard it. Footsteps behind me. Not an animal. Not the wind. Footsteps. Heavy. Steady. Keeping pace with me, just out of sight. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see. I started walking faster. The footsteps quickened too. I broke into a run. My pulse was roaring in my ears. I ran until my legs burned, until my breath came in ragged gasps. I ran until I couldn't hear anything but my own heartbeat. When I finally dared to stop, everything was silent. No footsteps, no movement, just the wind through the trees. My legs were shaking. I could barely stand. I had no idea how far I had come. My only thought was to keep going. Sometime before dawn, I stumbled onto a paved road. Civilization. I almost sobbed with relief. An hour later, I flagged down a passing truck. The driver, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, listened as I told him about the cabin, about the knife, about the footsteps. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. That cabin's been empty for years. Last guy that stayed there went missing. Never found him. I left my car. I left everything. I never went back. A week later, I checked the listing. It was gone. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A week in a remote cabin, alone, deep in the mountains. No people, no distractions, just me and the wilderness. I wanted to get away from everything. The constant noise of the city, the stress of work, the pressure of daily life. I needed silence. A real silence, the kind you can only find far from civilization. The drive up was long and winding. The roads were narrow, barely maintained, and littered with potholes. The deeper I went into the forest, the more I realized how isolated I was. My cell service had cut out miles back, and I hadn't seen another car for over an hour. The only signs of life were the occasional deer darting across the road and the birds circling in the gray sky above. The cabin sat at the end of an overgrown dirt path, almost hidden among the towering pines. It was smaller than I expected. A single-story wooden structure with a slanted roof, a small porch, and a lone window facing the dense trees. The wood was dark, weathered, and cracked in places, as if it had been sitting here for decades, untouched. I stepped out of my truck, the air immediately cooler than it had been in the valley below. A thick, damp smell of earth and pine filled my lungs. It was silent, except for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. No distant hum of cars, no voices, no planes overhead, just stillness. Inside, the cabin was bare but functional. A wood-burning stove, a sagging couch, a small kitchen with a rusted sink. There was a single bedroom in the back with a narrow bed and a window covered in dust. A few old hunting magazines were stacked on a rickety wooden table. It looked like no one had been here in years. I spent the first day settling in, chopping firewood, and taking a short hike before dusk. When the sun dipped below the trees, the temperature dropped fast. I built a fire in the stove, cooked a simple meal, and read by lantern light. It was exactly what I needed, just me and the quiet. Then, at some point in the night, I woke up. It wasn't a sound that woke me, it was something else. A feeling, like the air had changed, thickened somehow. I lay still, listening. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint, flickering shadows on the walls. I couldn't hear anything outside, but something felt off. I sat up slowly. The old mattress creaked beneath me. I reached for my flashlight and flicked it on, sweeping the beam around the small room. Nothing, just the same worn furniture, the same cracked walls. Then I noticed it, the front door. It was unlocked. I was sure I had locked it before bed. I remembered twisting the bolt, testing it to make sure it was secure. But now it was slightly ajar, just an inch or two, enough to see the darkness beyond it. A chill ran down my spine. I got up carefully, keeping the flashlight pointed at the door. My boots were by the bed. I slipped them on, feeling my pulse quicken. I reached for the hatchet I had used to split wood earlier that day and gripped it tight. I pushed the door open with the back of my hand, flashlight aimed into the darkness outside. The porch was empty. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their branches creaking. The ground was damp from the evening dew. No footprints, no signs of movement, just silence. I stepped out slowly, scanning the area. Nothing seemed disturbed, but that door hadn't opened on its own. Had I forgotten to lock it? Had the wind blown it open? No, the wind wasn't that strong. I stood there for a long time, listening. Then, finally, I went back inside and locked the door again. I wedged a chair under the handle for good measure. I didn't sleep much after that. The next day, I tried to shake it off. Maybe I had left it unlocked. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But I couldn't ignore the unease that lingered. I spent the day hiking, trying to clear my head. But the whole time I felt watched. The feeling was subtle, like something at the edge of my vision, just out of reach. The trees felt closer. The silence felt heavier. That night, I made sure the door was locked. I checked it 3 times before bed. I kept the hatchet within reach, the flashlight beside me. I woke up again. This time I heard it. Footsteps. Outside, just beyond the porch. Slow, deliberate. Not an animal. Not the random creaks of an old cabin settling. Human footsteps moving in the dirt. I held my breath, gripping the hatchet so tight my fingers ached. The footsteps stopped. Then, a long, tense silence. Then the doorknob turned. It didn't rattle. It didn't jerk. Turned smoothly, like someone testing it. Like someone who didn't need to force their way in. Someone who thought it should be open. I stayed completely still. The only sound was my own heartbeat, pounding in my ears. Then, the knob turned back, and the footsteps moved away. Slow, steady. Not running. Not afraid. I didn't move until the first light of dawn crept through the window. When I finally got up and checked outside, the ground was disturbed. A single set of footprints, leading from the trees to my door, and then back again. No car tracks, no tire marks, just footprints. I packed my things in record time, threw everything in the truck, and got out of there as fast as I could. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached the main road hours later, where my phone finally had service again. When I checked the weather, I noticed something strange. It had rained the night before, hard. The ground should have been wet, muddy, soft, but the footprints, they were dry. I don't know why I thought staying in the old hunting cabin alone was a good idea. It wasn't even my cabin. It belonged to a friend of a friend, Some guy I had never met but who was generous enough to let me use it for a few days. The idea was simple. Get away from the noise of the city, enjoy some solitude, and maybe do some hiking in the surrounding forest. But as soon as I arrived, I knew something about the place felt off. The cabin itself was old, built sometime in the 60s, and hadn't seen much upkeep since. The wood siding was warped from years of harsh winters, and the metal roof was speckled with rust. There was a small front porch, but the railing was missing in places, and the single rocking chair that sat there was bleached gray from the sun. The front door had a heavy iron latch instead of a standard lock, and when I pushed it open, the hinges let out a groan that echoed into the silence. Inside, it smelled of dust, wood, and something faintly sour like old sweat. There was a stone fireplace that took up most of one wall, a wooden table with two mismatched chairs, and a sagging couch covered in an ugly plaid fabric. The kitchen area was just a counter with an ancient propane stove and a deep, stained sink. The cabinets were stocked with canned goods, most of which looked years past their expiration date. The bedroom was small, just a bed with a lumpy mattress, a single dresser, and a tiny window that barely let in any light. There was no bathroom, just an outhouse a few yards behind the cabin, half hidden by overgrown brush. There was no cell service, no electricity, just me and whatever was out there in the woods. The first day went by without much trouble. I set my gear down, gathered some firewood, and made a simple dinner on the propane stove. The forest surrounding the cabin was thick, with pine and aspen trees towering over me. The quiet was absolute, broken only by the occasional chirp of a bird or rustle of leaves in the breeze. I found it peaceful at first, a break from the constant noise of the city. That night, however, things started to feel wrong. Lying in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The cabin made plenty of its own noises, the creaks and groans of old wood settling, the occasional scratching sound that I assumed was from mice in the walls. But there was something else. Presence. It felt as if someone was standing just outside the cabin, watching. I told myself it was paranoia, that I wasn't used to being so isolated. But that didn't stop the unease from creeping into my chest. I forced myself to sleep. It didn't last long. Sometime in the night, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside. Not an animal. Not the skittering of a squirrel or the cautious steps of a deer. These were heavy, deliberate footsteps, moving slowly around the cabin. My heart pounded as I listened, frozen beneath the thin blanket. The footsteps circled the cabin once, then twice. Then they stopped right outside the bedroom window. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My brain scrambled for logic. Maybe it was a hunter, lost in the woods. Maybe it was some old hermit who didn't realize the cabin was in use. But deep down, I knew better. Whoever it was, they were standing there, listening. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping the hunting knife I had brought with me. When the first light crept through the trees, I forced myself to step outside, scanning the area for any sign that someone had been there. The dirt around the cabin was dry and packed, not ideal for tracks, but near the window, in a patch of soft earth, I found them. Footprints, bare footprints. They weren't mine. They were larger, wider, and they led from the woods, circled the cabin, and then disappeared. I wanted to leave right then, pack my bag, hike back to my truck, and drive until I hit civilization. But pride got in the way. I told myself I was overreacting, that maybe they weren't as fresh as they looked. Maybe they had been there before I arrived, and I just hadn't noticed. I stayed, and that was a mistake. The second night was worse. I barricaded the door with the table, checked my knife a dozen times, and lay in bed staring at the ceiling. It wasn't long before the footsteps returned. They were louder this time, more confident. And they weren't alone. 2 sets of footsteps, maybe 3. They moved in different directions, one circling, another stopping just outside the door. I could hear breathing, slow, deep, measured. The kind of breathing you hear when someone is trying to be quiet but isn't quite succeeding. Then, a sound that made my stomach drop. The latch on the door rattled. I bolted upright, gripping the knife so hard my knuckles ached. The latch rattled again, harder this time. They were testing it, checking to see if I had locked it. Then silence. I stayed like that, rigid, for what felt like hours. Eventually, the sky began to lighten, and the sounds outside faded. When I finally found the courage to step outside, the footprints were back. And they were fresh. That was it. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my bag in record time, grabbed my hunting knife, and started the hike back to my truck, trying to ignore the feeling that I was being watched. I reached my truck just as the sun fully rose, the relief so overwhelming I nearly collapsed. I didn't look back as I drove away. Later, I told my friend what had happened. He went pale, said he'd heard stories about that cabin, about people who had stayed there and left feeling the same unease. Some even claimed they saw figures standing in the woods at night, just beyond the tree line. I don't know who or what was out there, but I do know one thing: I'm never going back. The drive out was longer than I remembered. The last time I had been up here was 2 years ago, before everything in my life had changed. Back then, I was engaged, living in the city, working a steady job. Now, things were different. The engagement was off. The city had drained me, and I'd left my job in favor of something less corporate, less soul-sucking. This trip to the cabin wasn't about nostalgia. It was about getting away from everything for a while, finding some clarity in the silence of the woods. I had inherited the cabin from my grandfather, a simple one-room structure deep in the mountains. It wasn't anything fancy, just a sturdy wooden shelter with a cast-iron stove, a small bed, and a few worn pieces of furniture. There was no electricity, no running water, just a well out back and an old propane lantern for light. It sat at the end of an overgrown dirt road, miles from the nearest paved street. The isolation had been part of its appeal. By the time I pulled up in my truck, the sun was setting behind the pines, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin looked the same as I remembered. Weathered wood, a sagging porch, the windows dark like empty eyes. I shut off the engine and stepped out, stretching my legs after the long drive. The air smelled like damp earth and pine needles, a crisp mountain scent that instantly made me feel lighter. I grabbed my duffel bag and headed inside. The heavy wooden door creaked as it swung open, and dust hung thick in the air, undisturbed since the last time I'd been here. I set my bag down on the cot and checked the cabinets for supplies. A few cans of beans, some rice, an old box of crackers that had probably gone stale. I'd brought enough food for the weekend, but it was good to know I had backup. After unpacking, I went out to the well to fill a jug with water. The handle was stiff from disuse, but after a few cranks, clear, cold water splashed into the bucket. I carried it inside, set it on the counter, and then went back out to gather some firewood before the light was completely gone. The trees whispered around me as I worked, the wind moving through the branches in long, drawn-out sighs. I had just finished stacking the wood on the porch when I heard it. A sound, faint but distinct, a branch snapping somewhere in the trees behind the cabin. I froze, listening. The wind had died down, leaving the forest eerily still. My heart started beating a little faster. Could have been a deer, I told myself, or a fox. The woods were full of animals. Still, I found myself scanning the tree line, looking for movement. Nothing. I shook it off and went inside, locking the door behind me. That night, I lit the propane lantern and sat at the small wooden table, eating a can of chili straight from the tin. The silence of the cabin was both comforting and unsettling, like being alone in a church after dark. I read for a while, an old paperback I had left here years ago, but my mind kept drifting back to the sound I'd heard. It was probably nothing, just my nerves playing tricks on me. At some point, I fell asleep. I woke up to a noise outside, a steady, rhythmic scraping against the porch. For a second, I thought I was dreaming. Then I heard it again, a long, slow drag of something heavy across the wooden planks. My stomach clenched. I reached for the flashlight beside my cot and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. The scraping stopped. I sat there, holding my breath, ears straining for any other sound. The wind had picked up again, rattling the branches outside. My brain scrambled for a rational explanation. Maybe an animal had knocked something over, Maybe it was just the wind shifting debris across the porch. But deep down, I knew neither of those explanations felt right. After a long minute, I got up and moved toward the door as quietly as I could. I pressed my ear against the rough wood and listened. Silence. I hesitated, then slowly unlatched the door and eased it open just a crack, shining my flashlight onto the porch. The beam swept across the wooden floorboards, revealing nothing but a few fallen leaves and my neatly stacked firewood. I stepped out, the cold night air prickling against my skin. The flashlight's beam cut through the dark, but beyond the clearing, the trees were an impenetrable wall of black. I listened, scanning the woods for movement, but there was nothing. Just the wind, the creak of the old porch beneath my feet. Then I saw them. Tracks. Large, deep impressions in the dirt, leading up onto the porch. My breath caught in my throat. They weren't boot prints. They weren't animal tracks either. They were wide, irregular, as if whatever had made them had been dragging something behind it. I followed them with my flashlight, tracing their path from the tree line to the steps, then back into the woods. My stomach twisted. Someone had been here. Someone, or something, had come right up to my door. And whatever it wasn't in a hurry to leave. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat up in the cot with my flashlight and my knife, listening to every creak, every rustle outside. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I stepped out onto the porch again, hoping I had imagined the tracks in the dark. They were still there, only now there were more of them. I didn't pack. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my keys, threw my bag in the truck, and peeled out of there, my tires kicking up dirt and gravel as I sped down the old road. I didn't stop until I reached the highway, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles ached. I never went back to that cabin. I sold it the following year, never telling the buyer what I had seen. Some places aren't meant to be lived in. Some places belong to something else, and I wasn't about to find out what. I took a trip out to the woods to get some time alone. I had been feeling the weight of everything: work, life, the constant hum of noise in the city. I wanted space, quiet, fresh air. A friend of a friend owned a cabin in a remote area of Montana and said I could use it for the week. It was an old hunting cabin, barely more than a shack, but that was fine. I wasn't looking for comfort. I just needed solitude. The drive took me nearly 10 hours. Once I turned off the main highway, the roads were just dirt and gravel, winding through miles of dense pine forest. There were no signs, no markers, just a set of directions scribbled on a piece of paper. After what felt like an eternity of driving deeper into nothing, I finally spotted the cabin. It was small, built of weathered logs, with a slanted metal roof that had rust creeping along the edges. The porch sagged slightly, and the windows were covered in grime. A woodpile was stacked against the side, an old axe buried in a chopping block nearby. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. I parked my truck in the clearing and grabbed my bag. The key was under a loose board on the porch, just like the note had said. The door stuck as I pushed it open, the wood swollen from rain. Inside, it was even smaller than I expected. A single room with a wood stove, a narrow cot, a rickety table, and a few mismatched chairs. Dust floated in the shafts of light coming through the window. A couple of shelves held some canned goods, a lantern, and an old coffee pot. I set my bag on the cot and went back outside to gather some firewood before the sun dipped too low. The woods felt vast and silent. No wind, no birds, just the occasional creak of trees shifting. The quiet was unsettling. I was used to some background noise, traffic, voices, the hum of a refrigerator. Here there was nothing, just me. That first night I barely slept. The cot was stiff, and every sound made my ears perk up. The wind picked up at some point, making the trees groan. I heard a rustling noise outside, maybe 20 yards from the cabin. Could have been anything, a raccoon, a deer. I told myself that and forced my eyes shut. Morning came slow. The sky was overcast, and a light drizzle misted the air. I made coffee on the wood stove and stepped onto the porch. The ground was soft from the rain, the air thick with the smell of wet pine. I saw something strange near the tree line. At first, I thought it was a fallen log, but then I realized it was something else. Footprints, not animal prints, human, barefoot. The sight of them sent a cold chill through me. The prints were fresh, not yet blurred by rain. They led from the woods to the edge of the clearing and then stopped. No return tracks, no sign of where they went next. I felt a deep unease settle in my gut. Maybe some hiker had wandered through, maybe a local out hunting. But why barefoot? And why come this close to the cabin just to stop? I scanned the trees, saw nothing. The forest stretched out in every direction, thick and endless. I went back inside, locked the door, and forced myself to shake it off. It was probably nothing. I spent the day chopping wood, reading, trying to keep my mind occupied. But every so often, I glanced toward the tree line, half expecting to see someone standing there. That night, the rain got heavier. It drummed against the metal roof, masking every other sound. The wind howled, rattling the cabin walls. I lay in the cot, staring at the ceiling, willing myself to sleep. Sometime in the night, a sound cut through the rain. A sharp, deliberate knock. I froze. Came again. 3 solid knocks against the wooden door. Every hair on my body stood on end. I didn't move, didn't breathe. My mind raced. Who would be out here in the middle of the night in the rain? The nearest town was miles away. I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed it at the door. I didn't call out. Didn't want whoever was out there to know I was awake. The cabin had one window, but it was too fogged up with moisture to see clearly. Minutes passed. Nothing. No more knocks. Just rain and wind. I sat up slowly, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then I heard something else, a slow, dragging sound, like someone shuffling their feet through the wet leaves. It circled the cabin, moving deliberately, stopping just beneath the window. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then silence. The air felt thick, electric. I strained my ears, listening, waiting. Then came a sound I'll never forget. A deep, slow exhale, right outside the window. I gripped the flashlight tighter. Every muscle in my body coiled. The breath was too slow, too controlled to be an animal. I sat there, frozen, waiting. Then, as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. I stayed awake until dawn. When the sun finally crept over the trees, I forced myself to step outside. The rain had washed away most of the footprints, but near the window, I saw them again. Barefoot prints, deep in the mud, standing perfectly still. Whoever it was had been there for a long time. Watching, I packed my things in record time, threw my bag in the truck and didn't look back. I drove out of there fast, not stopping until I reached the highway. I never told my friend what happened, never asked who else knew about the cabin. I just knew I would never go back. I had been driving for hours, winding through the dense forest, the road narrowing as I went deeper into the mountains. The rental cabin was supposed to be isolated, a quiet retreat where I could clear my head, away from the chaos of everyday life. I had planned this trip for weeks, wanting nothing more than to be alone in nature. No cell service, no distractions. Just me, the woods, and a few books. The sun was already sinking behind the treetops when I finally pulled up to the cabin. It was smaller than I expected. A simple wooden structure with a slanted metal roof and a wraparound porch. A single, dim porch light flickered as I stepped out of the car. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional chirp of insects. It was exactly what I wanted, peaceful, empty. I grabbed my bags and walked up the creaking steps, fumbling for the key the owner had left for me in a small lockbox by the door. The door swung open with a low groan, revealing the interior. A single room with a kitchenette on one side and a wood-burning stove in the corner. A narrow hallway led to a tiny bathroom and a single bedroom at the back. Everything was rustic but clean. The windows were large, letting in the last bit of daylight, though the thick trees outside cast long shadows across the floor. I set my bags down and went through the usual routine, checking the windows, locking the door, testing the water in the sink to make sure everything worked. There was no Wi-Fi and my phone showed no bars of service. That was fine. That was the point of this trip. The first night passed without much incident. I made a simple dinner, read for a while, and fell asleep to the sound of crickets outside. But by the second night, I started to notice things. Little things. First, it was the noises. I chalked them up to the cabin settling, the wind shifting the trees, a faint tapping against the wall, a soft creak on the porch. Normal sounds, I told myself. The kind of things you hear in an old building in the woods. Then there were the tracks. I had gone for a short hike that afternoon, taking a path that looped around the property. When I returned, I noticed fresh footprints in the dirt near the porch. Not mine. These were larger, deeper, like someone heavy had been walking around. I crouched down, studying them. They led from the edge of the trees to the front steps, then back into the woods. I stood up quickly, scanning the forest. The trees were still, the silence heavy. I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. Maybe a hunter had passed through. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. That night, the noises got worse. Something scraped against the side of the cabin. A slow, deliberate sound, like nails dragging across the wooden walls. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, straining to hear. The wind had died down. The night was unnervingly quiet. I grabbed the flashlight from my bedside table and crept to the window. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the porch and the trees beyond. Nothing moved, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. My skin prickled, and I stepped back from the window, forcing myself to breathe evenly. It was probably a raccoon, I told myself. A bear, maybe. Something looking for food. I barely slept that night, every creak and rustle keeping me on edge. When morning finally came, I stepped outside, feeling the chill of the dawn air. That's when I saw the scratches on the wall. Long, deep gouges running parallel down the wooden planks. Too high for an animal. Too deliberate. I packed my bags right then and there. I didn't care that I had planned to stay a few more nights. The trip was over. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to find out. As I loaded my car, I took one last look at the cabin. The front door was slightly ajar. I swore I had locked it. I didn't bother checking. I got in my car, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. I don't know why I ever thought a solo trip to a remote cabin in the dead of winter was a good idea. I liked solitude, and I loved the feeling of being completely alone in nature, but there was a fine line between solitude and isolation. I was about to learn just how thin that line was. The cabin sat deep in the mountains, far from any town. The nearest paved road was over an hour away. I had rented it for a full week, wanting nothing more than to unwind, read, and maybe do some writing. The listing had described it as a true off-grid experience, which I took to mean no running water and no electricity. That was fine with me. I brought plenty of supplies, firewood, canned food, a solar lantern, and enough water to last the whole trip. There was a wood-burning stove for warmth, and my truck was parked just outside in case I needed to leave. The first 2 days were peaceful. The silence was something I hadn't experienced in a long time. At night, I listened to the wind rattle the bare trees and the occasional sound of snow slipping off the roof. I kept the fire going, stayed wrapped in blankets, and enjoyed the disconnect from the world. On the third night, I woke up suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire had burned low, the embers casting a faint red glow. The only sound was the wind outside. Then I realized what had disturbed me. A noise that didn't belong. It had come from outside. A crunch, like something heavy stepping on the frozen ground. I sat up slowly, my breath visible in the cold air. The wind gusted again, making it hard to hear, but I listened. Another crunch, closer this time. I told myself it was just an animal. A deer, maybe, but it sounded too deliberate. I stayed completely still, waiting, listening. The footsteps stopped just outside the cabin. My truck was parked to the side, so there was nothing blocking the view from the single front window. If I had the nerve to move the curtain, I could probably see what was out there. I didn't move. For what felt like an eternity, I sat there, barely breathing. Then, just as suddenly as they had come, the footsteps retreated. Slow, measured steps moving back into the woods. I stayed awake the rest of the night, waiting for them to return. They didn't. By morning, I had convinced myself it was nothing. The wind had played tricks on me, or an animal had wandered too close. Still, I checked outside, scanning the ground. There were tracks, large, boot-shaped prints in the thin layer of snow, circling the cabin once before leading back into the woods. I told myself it was an old set of tracks, that they had been there before I arrived, and I just hadn't noticed them. But deep down, I knew better. I should have left that morning, packed up my things, thrown them into the truck, and driven away. But I didn't. I stayed. I had come all this way, and I wasn't going to let my imagination ruin the trip. The next 2 nights were quiet. Too quiet. I barely slept, listening for the sound of those footsteps, but they never came back. It wasn't until the 6th night that something else happened. It was late. The fire was still going, casting flickering light across the cabin walls. I had been reading when I heard it. A creaking sound, faint but distinct, came from the front door. I froze, book still in my hands. The door was locked. I had checked it multiple times. But there it was again, a slow, deliberate creak, like someone was pressing against it. I got up slowly, my heart pounding. There was a shotgun mounted on the wall, something the cabin owner had left, but I had no idea if it was loaded. I grabbed the fire poker instead, gripping it tightly. I stood there, staring at the door, waiting for it to move. Didn't. Minutes passed. The wind howled outside, but nothing happened. Finally, I forced myself to move. I crept to the window just enough to peek out. Nothing. Just darkness and snow. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By the time the sun rose, I had made my decision. I was leaving. I packed my things quickly, barely taking the time to eat. I went outside to start the truck. The driver's side door was open. I knew I had locked it. I checked every door before I went to bed. But now it was wide open, snow dusting the seat. I climbed in, my hands shaking as I reached for the keys in my coat pocket. I turned the ignition. Nothing. Not even a click. I tried again. Still nothing. The truck was dead. Panic set in. I was miles from the nearest road with no cell service, no way to call for help. I could hike out, but it would take hours in the snow, and the idea of walking through the woods knowing someone had been outside my cabin all week made my skin crawl. I forced myself to think. The battery was dead, but maybe it was just the cold. I popped the hood, went to check, and stopped cold. The battery was gone. Someone had taken it. Not just tampered with it, not just cut the wires, they had removed it completely. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees, feeling more exposed than I ever had in my life. I had no choice. I grabbed my pack, took only what I needed, and started walking. I kept my head down, moving fast, listening for any sound behind me. I didn't hear anything, but I felt it. The weight of unseen eyes watching, waiting. I walked for hours, my legs aching, my fingers numb. Just as the sun started to dip behind the mountains, I reached the main road. A single car passed, and I ran into the middle of the road, waving frantically. The driver stopped. I barely remember what I told him, just that I needed help. He took me to the nearest town, where I called the cabin owner and the police. They sent someone out to check the property. They found the truck, the cabin, my abandoned gear, but no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there at all. They told me it was probably an animal that had scared me, that my truck battery had been stolen by some random thief passing through. But I knew better. I never went back to that cabin. I never even tried to retrieve my things. Some nights, though, I still hear those footsteps in my dreams, circling just outside, waiting for me to open the door. I had rented the cabin for a week. It was supposed to be a getaway, a break from the constant noise of the city, a chance to breathe in fresh air and let my mind settle. It was a simple structure, a single-story log cabin tucked deep in the woods, far from any neighbors. The closest town was about 45 minutes away by car, and the last stretch of the road was a narrow, winding dirt path that made me second-guess my decision more than once on the way in. The cabin itself was old but sturdy. A small porch out front overlooked a clearing, beyond which the thick forest stretched endlessly in every direction. Inside, the furnishings were simple. Just a bed, a worn-out couch, a tiny kitchen area, and a wood-burning stove. The only modern amenity was the solar-powered lights, which flickered weakly when I tested them. There was no cell service, no Wi-Fi, and no way to contact anyone if something went wrong. That was the whole point. Or at least, that's what I told myself when I signed up for this trip. The first day was uneventful. I unpacked my things, set up a small fire outside, and cooked a quick meal. The silence out there was different from anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just quiet. It was an oppressive, suffocating absence of sound. No distant hum of cars, no background noise of people, no music. Just the occasional rustle of wind through the trees and the chirp of unseen insects. It was peaceful at first. Then it started to feel unnatural. I went to bed early that night, exhausted from the drive. The bed was stiff. The blankets smelled faintly of mildew, but I managed to drift off. At some point in the night, I woke up with a start. I wasn't sure why at first. Then I heard it, a noise just outside the cabin. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but distinct enough to stand out against the overwhelming quiet. A slow, deliberate shuffling of footsteps. I held my breath, listening. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. The footsteps stopped. Then came a soft scraping sound, like something dragging against the wooden porch. I stayed frozen in bed, every nerve in my body on edge. After what felt like an eternity, the noise stopped. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I stepped onto the porch and examined the ground. The dirt was disturbed in places, but there were no clear footprints, just random scuffs and marks, as if something had been moving around. Maybe it had been an animal, I reasoned, a raccoon or a deer, but something about it didn't sit right with me. I spent the day hiking, trying to shake the lingering unease. The forest was dense, the trails barely marked. At one point, I realized I hadn't seen a single other person the entire day. It was unsettling, but I reminded myself that isolation had been the goal. I kept moving, pushing deeper into the woods, hoping the exhaustion would help me sleep better that night. Didn't. I woke again to the same noise. Footsteps, closer this time. They circled the cabin, slow and deliberate. Then came the scraping sound again. I clenched my jaw, trying to control my breathing. I wanted to believe it was an animal, but deep down I knew better. No animal moved like that. No animal lingered outside a cabin for hours. I waited, muscles tense, until dawn broke. Then I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The marks on the porch were more pronounced this time. Long, uneven scratches in the wood, like something had been dragged. I scanned the tree line, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching. But there was nothing, just the trees and the thick morning fog rolling in. I debated leaving, packing up and cutting the trip short, but I told myself I was being paranoid. That night, I locked every door and window, double-checking each latch before climbing into bed. I kept my flashlight within reach, my knife on the nightstand. I woke to something tapping against the window, slow, rhythmic, deliberate. Not wind, not an animal. I turned my head, pulse hammering in my ears. The window was small, just beside the bed. The glass was old and dirty, barely reflective. But I saw it, just the faintest outline of a figure standing outside. Still, watching. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I just stared at the window, hoping, praying, that I was imagining it. Then the tapping came again, louder this time. My fingers curled around the handle of the knife. I wanted to move, to do something, but fear had me paralyzed. The figure stayed there for what felt like hours. Then, without warning, it moved away. The footsteps receded into the trees, and I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The first light, I packed my things. I didn't care how much time I had left on the rental. I wasn't staying another night. As I loaded up my car, I noticed something near the tree line. Something small, half buried in the dirt. I walked over, hesitant, and nudged it with my foot. It was a knife, rusted, old, the blade chipped and worn. Beside it, half hidden by the undergrowth, was a single boot print, larger than mine, fresh. I didn't stay to investigate further. I got in my car and left, not looking back once. The entire drive back to town, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But the road remained empty. I never reported what happened. What would I have said? That I heard noises? That I saw a shadow outside my window? That I found an old knife in the woods? There was no proof, just a feeling, a deep, bone-chilling certainty that I wasn't supposed to be there. That whoever had been outside my cabin that night had been waiting for something, or someone. I haven't gone back to the woods since, and I don't think I ever will. I was looking forward to the solitude. That was the point of renting a remote cabin, just me, the quiet, and a break from the world. It was an old logging cabin, deep in the mountains, surrounded by thick trees and miles away from the nearest town. No cell service, no internet, just a wood stove, a creek for water, and a single-lane dirt road leading in and out. Perfect. The drive up had been long, the last hour spent crawling over rough, rutted roads that hadn't seen maintenance in years. The cabin sat in a clearing, tucked into the trees with a steep hillside rising behind it. The air was cool, carrying the damp smell of pine and moss. A small porch sagged under the weight of time, and the windows were dark, the old glass warped. It looked exactly like the photos, worn but sturdy, isolated, exactly what I wanted. I spent the first evening settling in. The cabin had an old propane stove, a rickety wooden table, and a single bed pushed against the far wall. A heavy iron wood stove squatted near the center of the room, its pipe vanishing into the ceiling. There was no electricity, just oil lamps and candles. I stacked firewood inside, filled a couple of pots with water from the creek, and set my gear by the door. As the sun dipped behind the trees, I lit a lantern and sat on the porch, listening to the wind moving through the branches. Peaceful. The first night passed quietly. The air turned cold, and I kept the fire going until early morning. At some point, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside, branches snapping, a soft thud, probably an animal. I listened for a while, but whatever it was moved off and I fell back asleep. The next day, I explored the area. The forest was thick, the kind that swallowed sound. Trails wound through the trees, old logging roads barely visible under layers of fallen needles. I followed one for a while, walking until I found an old clearing where trees had been felled decades ago. The stumps were moss-covered, rotting. Something about the silence felt different there, too still. The hairs on my arms lifted. I turned back. That night, I locked the door, not out of fear, just habit. The wind picked up, rattling the branches against the roof. As I lay in bed, I heard it again. Movement outside. Not an animal this time. The steps were too deliberate, heavy. I held my breath, listening. The sound moved around the cabin, slow and careful. A pause. Then, the unmistakable creak of a loose porch board. I sat up. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows against the walls. My pulse thudded in my ears. Another creak. I waited, listening for the door handle. Nothing. Minutes passed. The wind howled. Eventually, I convinced myself it was the wind shifting the old boards. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt. Not boots, bare feet, human. They circled the cabin, stopping at the windows, the porch. My stomach tightened. I had no neighbors, no reason for anyone to be out here. The road in was rough enough that only someone determined would make the drive. The tracks led back into the trees, vanishing into the undergrowth. I had no idea how long they'd been there. I spent the day chopping wood, trying to shake the unease. I carried my hatchet with me, even when I went to the creek for water. The woods felt different, the silence heavier. I considered leaving, but convinced myself I was being paranoid. Maybe some drifter had wandered through, looking for shelter. It didn't mean they'd come back. That night, I kept the lantern lit. The wind had died down, leaving only the crackling of the fire and my own breathing. Then, Around midnight, the footsteps returned. This time, they didn't stop at the porch. They circled, slow, measured. I gripped my hatchet, heart hammering. The lantern cast a glow through the windows, but I saw nothing. The steps stopped at the back of the cabin, near the wall where my bed was. I held my breath. Something brushed the wood outside. Fingers? A nail scratching? My skin crawled. Then silence. Minutes passed. An hour. I sat there, hatchet in hand, waiting. Eventually, exhaustion won. When morning came, I found more footprints. This time, they led from the tree line straight to my door, then back into the woods. No tire tracks, no sign of anyone leaving by the road. Just those bare footprints, deep in the dirt. I packed my things, threw everything into my truck as fast as I could. The drive back down that narrow road felt endless, every shadow between the trees pressing in. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. Even then, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave. I never went back. I had been searching for solitude, a place to clear my head, to be alone with my thoughts. The stress of everyday life had been wearing me down, and when I stumbled across a listing for an off-grid cabin deep in the mountains, it seemed like the perfect escape. No cell service, no internet, just me and the wilderness. The drive took most of the day. The roads went from smooth asphalt to cracked pavement, then to gravel and finally dirt. The deeper I went into the forest, the more isolated I felt. The directions had been simple enough, and the last turn led me onto a narrow, winding path barely wide enough for my truck. Trees closed in on either side, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. When I finally saw the cabin, relief washed over me. It was exactly as the listing had described. A small, single-room structure with a covered porch and a woodpile stacked neatly against the side. There was an outhouse a short walk away and a well for water. No electricity, just a wood stove for heat and a few oil lanterns for light. It was perfect. I spent the first few hours settling in. I unpacked my supplies, chopped some wood, and made sure everything was in order. As the sun began to set, I lit one of the lanterns and sat on the porch, taking in the stillness. The forest was alive with sound. Crickets chirping, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was peaceful, but as the night deepened, that peacefulness began to shift into something else. The sounds of the forest changed. The usual rustling of small creatures gave way to something heavier, something deliberate. Footsteps, slow and measured, moving just beyond the reach of the lantern light. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer, maybe even a bear, but the longer I listened, the more uneasy I became. The steps weren't the erratic movements of an animal foraging or moving through the brush. They were steady, purposeful, almost human. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the source, but the darkness made it impossible. My instincts screamed at me to go inside, so I did. I locked the door, bolted the single wooden shutter over the window, and sat by the stove, listening. The footsteps continued for a while, circling the cabin. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. I barely slept that night. Every time I drifted off, I would jerk awake, certain I had heard something just outside. When morning finally came, I felt foolish. It had to have been my imagination, fueled by the isolation and the deep, unfamiliar darkness of the forest. Determined to shake off the nerves, I spent the day exploring. The woods were dense, the undergrowth thick, but I followed an old hunting trail that wound up a ridge behind the cabin. From the top, I could see for miles. Rolling hills covered in endless trees, untouched and wild. It was beautiful. On my way back, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Near the cabin, just off the path, the underbrush was disturbed. The ground was scuffed up, and there were deep impressions in the soil. Footprints, not animal tracks, but boots. Someone had been walking around near my cabin. I forced myself to stay calm. Could have been an old hunter's trail. Maybe someone had passed through recently, but the thought didn't sit well with me. The prints looked fresh. That night, I made sure the fire was stocked and the lanterns were filled. I sat up late, listening. At first, everything was quiet, just the usual night sounds. But then, just like before, the footsteps returned. This time, they didn't circle the cabin. They stopped right outside the door. I held my breath, heart hammering. The doorknob rattled. Not violently, not like someone trying to force their way in, but a slow, deliberate test. A chill ran down my spine. Whoever was out there was checking to see if the door was locked. I reached for the axe I had brought inside earlier and gripped it tightly. The rattling stopped, and for a long moment, there was silence. Then the footsteps moved away, fading into the forest. I didn't sleep at all. When morning came, I stepped outside cautiously, axe still in hand. There were fresh footprints in the dirt, leading from the tree-line to my door. They weren't mine. I followed them a short distance before they disappeared into the undergrowth. I had planned to stay for a week. By that point, I was seriously reconsidering, but I told myself I was being paranoid. There was no proof that whoever had been outside meant me any harm. Maybe it was a lost hiker, maybe someone just passing through. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That day, I kept my axe close, my ears tuned to every sound. And when night fell, I made sure everything was locked up tight. I barely breathed as the footsteps returned, closer this time. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A slow, deliberate scraping against the wooden wall of the cabin. Something was dragging along the outside, circling me. Then, a faint, rhythmic tapping on the window shutter. Not forceful, just enough to let me know that whoever was out there wanted me to know they were there. I had had enough. I wasn't going to wait around to find out what their intentions were. I grabbed my keys, my bag, and my axe and waited for the noises to stop. When they finally did, I crept out onto the porch, scanning the darkness. I didn't see anything, but I could feel eyes on me. I made my way to my truck as quickly and quietly as possible, my heart pounding. I turned the key and the engine roared to life. Headlights flooded the clearing, and for a split second, just before I threw it into drive, I saw movement at the tree-line. Someone stepping back into the shadows. I didn't wait to see more. I gunned it, tearing down the dirt path, not looking back. I drove straight through the night, only stopping when I reached the first gas station miles away. Only then did I let myself breathe. I never went back for my things. I never even contacted the person who rented me the cabin. I didn't want to know. I just wanted to forget. But I can't, because sometimes when I'm alone at night, I hear it again. That slow, deliberate tapping. And I wonder if whoever was out there that night has found someone else to visit. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. A remote cabin deep in the woods, away from everything. No cell service, no people, just the sounds of the wind moving through the trees and the occasional rustling of wildlife. I had booked the place online, a one-room log cabin sitting on a small clearing, miles from the nearest road. It had no electricity, only a wood stove for heat, and a small creek running nearby for water. It was exactly what I needed. A place to reset, to be alone, to let my mind rest. The drive up was long, winding through miles of forest on dirt roads that grew rougher the deeper I went. By the time I reached the turnoff, I had been driving for nearly 5 hours. My truck's tires crunched over the gravel as I pulled into the clearing where the cabin stood. The structure was simple, just a rectangle of logs with a peaked metal roof, a stone chimney at one end, and a small porch with a single wooden chair. A stack of firewood was piled neatly against one side, and a narrow footpath led down to the creek. I shut off the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the silence. The air smelled clean, crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth. I got out and stretched, feeling the stiffness in my legs. The wind had a slight bite to it, hinting at colder temperatures once the sun set. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat and made my way up the short set of steps onto the porch. The key was in the lock, just as the owner had promised. I turned it, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. The cabin was even smaller than I had expected. A single room with a bed in one corner, a small wooden table with 2 chairs, and a cast iron stove against the far wall. Shelves lined one side, stocked with a few canned goods, an old oil lantern, and a tin box filled with matches. A single window overlooked the trees behind the cabin, its glass slightly warped with age. The floor was bare wood, scuffed and worn. It smelled like old timber and ash. I set my bag down by the bed and took a moment to look around. It was simple, but it was all I needed. The wind picked up outside, rattling the trees. I moved to the stove, checking the firewood supply. Enough to last a few nights, though I would need to gather more if I stayed longer. I pulled off my jacket, rolled up my sleeves, and got to work. By the time I had a fire going, the sun was starting to dip below the trees. The warmth spread through the small space, pushing back the creeping chill. I pulled a can of soup from the shelf, opened it with my pocket knife, and set it on the stove to heat. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving an eerie stillness in its place. I listened, hearing only the crackle of the fire and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. It wasn't until later, as I was lying in bed, that I started to feel uneasy. It was that strange, creeping sensation, not fear exactly, but awareness, like the way you feel when you wake up in the middle of the night and know, instinctively, that someone is standing in the dark just outside your field of vision. I listened, straining my ears. Nothing, just the fire, burning low in the stove, and the wind, barely more than a whisper now. But something felt off. The silence outside wasn't normal. In the woods, there's always some kind of noise, branches shifting, animals moving, the distant call of an owl. But now there was nothing, just absolute, suffocating stillness. I rolled over, telling myself I was being paranoid. It was just the isolation playing tricks on me. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept waking up, the silence pressing against me like a weight. At some point, I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was awake again and something was different. The fire was out. The room was dark, the air cold. I sat up, blinking in the blackness. My breath came out in a visible cloud. I reached for my flashlight, clicking it on. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating the rough wooden walls. Everything looked the same, but the fire shouldn't have gone out that quickly. I had stalked it well before lying down. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, the floor freezing beneath my feet. I moved toward the stove, crouching down. The ashes were cold. That wasn't right. Even if the fire had died out, the embers should still have been warm. But they weren't. It was like the fire had been put out, deliberately. I stood up slowly, scanning the room. The door was still locked. The window was shut, but something didn't feel right. I moved to my bag, pulling out my knife. The weight of it in my hand was reassuring, but it didn't do much to calm my nerves. Then I heard it, a sound outside, faint, a soft scrape, like something moving just beyond the cabin walls. I froze, listening. Another sound, closer this time. A footstep. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering in my ears. I moved toward the window, careful not to make any noise. I lifted the edge of the curtain, just enough to see outside. The moon cast a dim glow over the clearing, the trees stretching into the darkness beyond. Nothing moved, but I knew, deep in my gut, that something was out there, watching. Then another sound. This time, it came from the other side of the cabin. I turned, gripping the knife tighter. My truck was parked just outside. If I needed to, I could make a run for it. But something told me that wasn't the best option. I needed to wait, to listen. For what felt like hours, I stood there, barely breathing. The sounds outside came and went, sometimes distant, sometimes close, but never clear enough to see what was making them. Eventually, the first light of dawn crept through the trees. The moment it did, the noises stopped. I waited until the sun was fully up before stepping outside. The cold morning air burned my lungs. I scanned the clearing, looking for anything, footprints, disturbed dirt, anything that might explain what had been out there. But there was nothing, just the stillness of the forest, like the night before had never happened. I didn't waste time. I packed my things, threw them into the truck, and got in. As I started the engine, I felt that same sensation again. like I was being watched. I forced myself not to look back as I pulled out of the clearing, the cabin shrinking behind me. I drove for hours, only stopping once I reached a gas station near the highway. I sat there for a long time, hands gripping the wheel, trying to shake the feeling that whatever had been out there was still watching me. I never went back. I could feel the road changing beneath my tires long before I saw the turnoff. The pavement, once smooth, had gradually turned rough, then into a patchwork of uneven gravel. Each mile I drove further from the main highway felt like a step deeper into isolation. The trees grew taller, denser, blocking out the last of the golden evening light. My destination was a remote cabin deep in the woods, a rental I'd found through an online listing promising solitude and seclusion. The listing had been vague, mostly boasting about the lack of cell service and the abundance of wildlife. It was exactly what I wanted, a break from the noise of daily life. I had stocked up on groceries, packed plenty of firewood, and made sure my car was in good shape before heading out. There was a certain nervousness in the back of my mind, that instinctual unease that comes with being completely alone in a place you've never been before, but I ignored it. I had camped alone plenty of times. This wouldn't be any different. The driveway to the cabin was barely a road, just a rutted-out dirt path overgrown with weeds. My car groaned as I maneuvered carefully over rocks and potholes. By the time I saw the cabin through the trees, the sun was nothing more than a dull glow behind the hills. The cabin was smaller than I expected, just a simple A-frame with a wraparound porch, perched at the edge of a thick forest. No neighbors, no other signs of civilization, just the sound of the wind in the trees and the distant call of some unseen bird. It was perfect. The first thing I did after unlocking the door was inspect the place. It was as basic as the photos had shown. A small living room with a wood stove, a kitchen with a propane stove, a single bedroom, and a cramped bathroom. There was no electricity aside from a few dim solar-powered lights, and the water came from a hand pump in the kitchen. I set my bags down and went back outside to unload the firewood from my car, taking in the absolute silence around me. The nearest town was nearly an hour away, and I hadn't seen another person in miles. I should have felt relaxed, but instead, I felt exposed, vulnerable. The logical part of my brain told me it was just the effect of being alone in the middle of nowhere, but I still double-checked that the door locked properly when I went back inside. As the night fell, I built a fire in the wood stove and made a simple dinner. The silence outside was overwhelming. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, no music, just the occasional creak of the cabin settling and the wind moving through the trees. Every little sound made me hyper-aware of just how alone I was. I slept lightly, waking up at every small noise. Around 2 a.m., I heard something outside, just a faint rustling, like dry leaves being disturbed. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then came a sound that was unmistakable. Slow, deliberate footsteps just beyond the porch. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps were steady, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. Too slow to be an animal, too heavy. My body tensed as I lay motionless in bed. I had locked the door, but the windows had no shutters, just thin curtains barely concealing the inside. I told myself it had to be a deer or some other large animal wandering close, but something about the way it moved made my skin crawl. I heard a faint creak, the porch. For the longest time, I heard nothing. No footsteps, no rustling. Then, suddenly, something scratched lightly against the door. I shot up, heart pounding. It wasn't a knock. It wasn't forceful. Just a slow, testing scrape along the wood. My breath felt stuck in my throat. My hunting knife was in my backpack across the room, and I cursed myself for not keeping it closer. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. I sat in silence, waiting, listening. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing. By the time the first hint of daylight broke through the trees, I convinced myself it had been an animal. Maybe a raccoon or a porcupine. Something harmless. Still, I checked outside as soon as it was bright enough to see. The dirt around the cabin was dry, but near the porch, I found footprints. Human footprints. Barefoot. I stared at them, my skin crawling. They weren't fresh, already slightly disturbed by the wind, but they were clear. Someone had walked around my cabin during the night. Someone had stood on the porch, listening. I packed my things in under 5 minutes. The drive back to the highway was the longest I had ever taken. Every turn in the road felt like it was hiding something watching me. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. When I returned the key to the rental company, I asked about the cabin's history, about the area. The man behind the desk just shrugged. "Nobody's rented that place in a while," he said. "Too far out for most people. You're the first in months." I didn't tell him about the footprints. I didn't tell anyone. But I knew one thing. Whoever had been outside my cabin that night, they weren't lost. They weren't a hiker who had wandered too far. They had been waiting, and they had been barefoot. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A full week alone in a remote cabin deep in the woods. Just me and the quiet. No emails, no traffic, no noise. Just the sounds of nature and the crackle of a fire. I had rented the place through a small, independent site that catered to people like me, people who wanted solitude and didn't mind being off-grid. The drive took longer than I expected. The last stretch of road was a barely maintained dirt path winding through dense trees. I had to slow down to a crawl to avoid the potholes and rocks, the forest pressing in on either side. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. The place was small but sturdy, built from thick logs with a wraparound porch. There was a woodpile stacked neatly against the side, and a stone chimney jutted up from the roof. The nearest neighbor was over 10 miles away, and cell service had cut out at least an hour back. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. It smelled of pine and dust, the air cool and slightly damp. The interior was simple, one main room with a wood stove, a small kitchen area, a table with 2 chairs, and a narrow staircase leading up to a lofted sleeping area. There was a single window above the sink and another beside the front door. Both were grimy but intact. After unloading my supplies and lighting a few candles, I built a fire in the stove. The warmth spread slowly through the cabin, easing the evening chill. I ate a quick meal and sat on the porch, watching the last light fade behind the trees. The silence was complete. Not a car, not a voice, not even the hum of distant electricity. Just the wind in the branches and the occasional call of a night bird. It was perfect. ####. The first night, I woke to a sound outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I lay still, listening, I heard it again. Something moving through the trees. A deliberate crunch of leaves, the snap of a small branch. I held my breath, straining to hear more, but it faded into the distance. Probably an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe a coyote. I had chosen this place specifically because it was remote. I had to expect wildlife. Still, I lay awake for a long time, staring at the dark ceiling, waiting for the sounds to return. They didn't. ####. The second day was uneventful. I spent the morning exploring the area, hiking down to a small creek I had seen on the map. The water was icy cold, rushing over smooth stones, clear enough to see fish darting beneath the surface. The forest felt different in the daylight, less oppressive, more alive. I even found an old hunting stand, half collapsed and overtaken by moss. I spent the afternoon chopping wood and reading on the porch. As the sun set, I made dinner and sat by the fire, enjoying the quiet. But as darkness settled over the trees, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling from the night before. I locked the door and double-checked the windows before heading to bed. ####. That night, I heard the sound again. Closer. It was the same careful movement through the trees, slow and deliberate. This time, I sat up, heart pounding, straining to see through the small window. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the forest was a black void beyond the glass. Then, a soft, unmistakable sound. A footstep on the porch. I froze. The fire had burned down to embers, casting weak, flickering light across the room. My breath sounded too loud in the silence. Another step, closer to the door. I reached for the flashlight on the bedside table and clicked it on, aiming the beam toward the cabin entrance. The light caught the wood grain of the door, the handle unmoving. Nothing through the window, no shadows. I sat there for what felt like hours, gripping the flashlight, waiting, but the footsteps didn't return. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into uneasy sleep. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. The third day, I found the footprints. They were in the dirt around the porch, deep impressions, heavier than any animal, the shape unmistakably human. Someone had been there. I felt a sick drop in my stomach. Had they been watching me? Had they tried the door while I was asleep? I scanned the tree line, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows. The woods felt different now. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was suffocating, unnatural. I thought about leaving, packing up, and driving back to civilization. But it could have been a hiker passing through, someone who had no idea the cabin was occupied. Maybe they had seen the lights and moved on. I tried to convince myself of that. That night, I kept the hatchet next to my sleeping bag. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. On the fourth night, the knocking started. It came just after midnight, a slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap on the front door. I sat up so fast my head spun. My skin prickled, every nerve in my body on edge. The knocking came again, steady, unhurried. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I wanted to call out, to demand who was there, but my throat had closed up. The fire had burned low again, barely illuminating the room. The flashlight sat on the table just out of reach. Then the doorknob rattled. Something slammed against the door, hard enough to shake the walls. I scrambled out of bed, grabbing the hatchet. Another impact, something heavy hitting the wood, the hinges creaking under the force. I had locked it. I knew I had. And then, silence. I stood there, my breath coming in shallow gasps, staring at the door. The seconds stretched into minutes. Nothing. No more knocking. No more rattling. Just the fire's faint glow and my own hammering heartbeat. I didn't sleep after that. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. By morning, I had made my decision. I packed everything in record time, throwing my gear into the truck and locking up the cabin behind me. I didn't look for more footprints. I didn't check the woods. I just got in and drove, forcing myself not to look in the rearview mirror. The whole drive back, I kept expecting to see something in the trees, figure, a shadow, anything, but the forest was still. I never went back to that cabin. I never reported what happened. What would I have said? That someone had watched me? That they had waited until the dead of night to let me know they were there? No one would believe me, but I knew, and I would never go back. I was looking for quiet. That's the only reason I rented the cabin. It was late October, and I needed a break from everything. Work, people, the noise of the city. I found a listing for an old hunting cabin up in the mountains, about 4 hours from home. It was advertised as secluded, rustic, and peaceful. No Wi-Fi, no electricity, just a wood-burning stove and a well for water. It sounded perfect. The drive up was long, the last stretch of road barely maintained. Potholes, loose gravel, and the occasional deep rut made me nervous in my old SUV. The trees were thick, their branches bare, skeletal fingers stretching into the sky. The further I drove, the more the road narrowed, until it was little more than a single lane cutting through dense forest. By the time I arrived, the sun was dipping low behind the mountains. The cabin sat in a clearing, a squat, weathered structure made of thick logs. It had a metal roof, rusted in places, and a front porch with an old rocking chair that creaked slightly in the wind. The air was crisp, smelling of damp earth, and would smoke from some distant cabin I couldn't see. I let myself in with the key left under a loose brick on the porch. Inside, the place was basic, just a cot, a table with 2 chairs, and a wood-burning stove. A shelf in the corner held a few cans of food, some dusty plates, and an old lantern. There was a small window above the cot, its single pane cloudy with age. Another window looked out onto the trees at the back. There was a door leading outside from the kitchen area, though I didn't see much reason to use it. I settled in quickly, lighting the lantern and starting a fire in the stove. The warmth spread slowly, the only sounds the occasional pop from the wood and the wind outside. I ate a simple meal, then sat in the rocking chair on the porch, listening. There was nothing but the rustling of dry leaves and the faint hoot of an owl. Then I heard something else. It was faint, barely noticeable at first. A steady, rhythmic creaking. I assumed it was the wind pushing the trees, but when I focused on it, I realized it was coming from the woods. It sounded too deliberate, too even to be the random groaning of branches in the wind. I strained my eyes in the fading light, but the forest was nothing but dark shadows. The noise stopped. I told myself it had just been my imagination and went back inside. That night, I slept lightly. The cabin had a strange atmosphere, not quite unsettling, but different, isolated. I woke up several times, listening to the quiet. At some point, I heard movement outside, soft crunching footsteps on the leaves. I held my breath, but the noise faded before I could be sure I wasn't just dreaming. The next day was uneventful. I spent the morning chopping some wood, took a short walk around the clearing, and read an old book I had brought with me. The day passed quickly, and as the sun set, the temperature dropped sharply. I made dinner and sat in the rocking chair again, watching the forest turn black. Then the creaking started again. It was slow, rhythmic, just like before. This time, I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the trees. The beam cut through the dark, but all I saw were the trunks and bare branches. The noise stopped. My heart was pounding. I listened for another minute, then went inside, locking the door. That night, I was woken by something moving outside. It wasn't the wind. It was footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the dead leaves. My breath caught in my throat as I listened. Whoever or whatever it was, they were moving around the cabin. I could hear the sound shifting from one side to the other. Then came a soft scraping noise, like something dragging along the wooden walls. I grabbed the axe I had brought inside earlier and sat up in bed, holding my breath. The noise stopped for what felt like hours. Then, just as I was starting to convince myself I had imagined it, there was a single knock on the front door. A slow, heavy knock. I didn't move. My pulse pounded in my ears. Another knock, just as deliberate as the first. Then silence. I stayed like that for the rest of the night, gripping the axe until my fingers ached. No more knocks came, but I heard movement just outside the window, the occasional crunch of leaves. When the first light of dawn broke, I finally let myself exhale. I stepped onto the porch, gripping the axe tight. The ground was disturbed. Leaves had been shuffled around. Something had definitely been outside my cabin. I walked around the perimeter, my nerves tight. Then I saw them. Footprints. Human footprints, large and deep, leading from the trees to my cabin and then away again. I didn't stay another night. I packed my things and left, driving as fast as I could down that rutted road. I never found out who or what had been out there. Maybe it was a hunter, some drifter, or just some backwoods lunatic. But one thing was certain. I had not been alone in that forest. I never went back, and I never will. I had been searching for a secluded place to unwind, somewhere far away from the noise of the city. After weeks of looking, I found a listing online for a cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana. It was advertised as remote, with no cell service and miles away from the nearest town. That was exactly what I wanted. A week alone, just me and the wilderness. The drive out there was long, stretching nearly 8 hours from my home. The last 2 hours were nothing but winding dirt roads cutting through dense forest. My truck kicked up dust as I navigated the narrow path, the trees crowding in on either side, thick and towering. The directions had been clear. Follow the road until I saw a small wooden sign nailed to a tree that read, "Private Property." Beyond that, a barely visible turnoff led to the cabin. When I finally arrived, the sun was low in the sky, casting an orange glow over the clearing. The cabin stood there, simple and sturdy. A single-story wooden structure with a wraparound porch, dark green shutters, and a heavy wooden door. There was a small woodshed about 20 yards away and an old water pump next to it. Behind the cabin, the forest stretched endlessly, untouched and silent. I stepped out of my truck, breathing in the crisp, pine-scented air. The silence was almost overwhelming. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, no modern intrusions. Just the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. It was perfect. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The interior was cozy, with wooden walls and a stone fireplace. A small kitchen area with an old-fashioned stove and a battered wooden table sat to the left. To the right, a single bedroom with a narrow bed and a dresser. Everything was clean but had that unmistakable aged smell, like wood that had soaked up decades of smoke and solitude. After unloading my gear, I lit the oil lamps scattered around the cabin and started a fire in the hearth. There was no electricity, but that was fine. I had brought plenty of supplies: canned food, a hunting knife, a rifle in case of wildlife, and enough firewood to last me through the week. It was shaping up to be exactly the quiet retreat I had hoped for. That first night was peaceful. I sat on the porch, drinking whiskey from a flask and watching the stars. The sky was clear, the kind of darkness you only get far away from civilization. Eventually, I turned in, the crackling fire in the hearth the only sound as I drifted off to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night to a noise outside, a rhythmic crunching, like footsteps moving slowly over the dried leaves and underbrush. My heart pounded as I lay still, listening. It wasn't an animal. Animals move with a different kind of rhythm, erratic, darting movements. This was steady, deliberate. I reached for my rifle, creeping to the window. The porch was empty, but the sound hadn't stopped. It was circling the cabin, just beyond the ring of firelight cast from my lamps. I strained my eyes, trying to see past the darkness. Nothing. Then silence. I stood there, gripping my rifle, waiting. Minutes passed. Nothing moved. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been my imagination, perhaps a deer, curious but cautious. Still, I didn't sleep well after that. The next morning, I stepped outside to check the area. The ground was covered in leaves and pine needles, but something stood out. Large, heavy footprints in the dirt, circling the cabin. They weren't from an animal. The shape was too human, too deliberate, but there were no other signs of disturbance. No broken branches, no claw marks, no blood, just those footprints. I spent the day exploring the woods, trying to shake off my unease. The forest was beautiful, but it had an unnerving stillness. I didn't see any signs of other people. No cabins, no trails, nothing to suggest someone else was nearby. But I couldn't ignore those footprints. Someone had been out there. That night, I locked the door and made sure my rifle was loaded before going to bed. I kept the fire burning low and lay there, listening. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up to something tapping against the window. Tap, tap, tap. I held my breath, my body rigid. The sound was slow, deliberate, like someone testing the glass. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see the window from the corner of my eye. There was no face, no silhouette, just darkness beyond the glass. Then the tapping stopped. A long pause, followed by the unmistakable sound of the porch boards creaking. Someone or something was walking up to the door. I sat up slowly, gripping my rifle. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then the handle rattled, just once. Not forcefully, but enough to send a jolt of terror through my body. I shot up, aimed my rifle at the door, and shouted, "Who's there?" Silence. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. Then, finally, the footsteps retreated. I waited, listening, my heart hammering in my chest. When I was sure they were gone, I stayed awake until dawn, watching the door, waiting. When morning came, I stepped outside cautiously, my rifle still in hand. More footprints, leading away from the cabin. I followed them for a while, but they eventually disappeared into the underbrush. No sign of where they had come from, no sign of anyone living nearby. I lasted one more night before I decided to leave. That final night was the worst. I heard movement outside again, closer this time. It circled the cabin repeatedly, stopping at the door, the windows. I never saw who or what it was, but it wanted me to know it was there. As soon as the sun rose, I packed my gear and left, driving down that long dirt road without looking back. I never reported it. What would I even say? That someone had been out there watching me? That I had spent 3 nights alone in a cabin with something just beyond the firelight? Waiting? I never went back. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there. But I know one thing. I was not alone in those woods. It started as a simple plan. A week alone in a remote cabin, deep in the woods, far away from everything. I wanted to disconnect from the noise of daily life, to let my mind settle in the quiet. It wasn't my first time doing something like this. I had spent plenty of nights alone in the wilderness, camping or renting isolated cabins, and I never once felt afraid. This time felt no different, at least at first. The cabin was a small, one-room structure with a lofted sleeping area, a wood stove, and a narrow porch. It sat about 10 miles from the nearest paved road, surrounded by thick pine and aspen forest. There was no running water, only a hand pump outside, and electricity came from a small solar panel that barely kept the lights on after dark. I had a satellite phone for emergencies, but beyond that, I was completely alone. That's exactly what I wanted. The first 2 days were peaceful. I spent my time chopping wood, hiking the narrow trails around the cabin, and sitting by the creek that ran a few hundred yards down the slope. Nights were quiet, just the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of some small animal in the underbrush. The solitude was perfect, but on the 3rd night, things started to change. It was past midnight when I woke up, feeling uneasy. I wasn't sure why. The cabin was silent, no wind, no rain, nothing out of the ordinary. Yet, something felt off. I listened, waiting for a sound, a reason for my unease. Nothing, just the stillness pressing against my ears. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my mind adjusting to the isolation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next morning, I went about my routine, but I noticed something strange. The pile of firewood I had stacked near the door was disturbed. A few logs had rolled several feet away, lying in the dirt. It wasn't windy, and no animals around here were big enough to knock them over like that. Maybe I had stacked them poorly, I told myself, but I knew that wasn't true. That night, I made sure to secure the door tightly before bed. The latch was simple but sturdy. Nothing could push it open from the outside. I laid in my sleeping bag, staring at the wooden ceiling above me, listening. At some point, exhaustion won over and I drifted off. I don't know how long I slept before I woke up again, this time to a sound. A faint scratching just outside the cabin. It wasn't the frantic scrambling of a rodent or the occasional rustle of a raccoon. It was deliberate, slow, dragging. I sat up, heart pounding. The sound continued, moving from one side of the cabin to the other, just beneath the porch. I didn't move. I barely breathed. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped. I waited, straining to hear anything, but all I got was silence. Slowly, I reached for the flashlight beside my sleeping bag and clicked it on. I hesitated before standing, then moved toward the door. My fingers hovered over the latch, but I didn't open it. I wasn't sure I wanted to know what was out there. Instead, I pressed my ear against the wood, listening. Nothing. The next morning, I found deep scratches in the porch wood, parallel lines, like something had dragged its nails across the surface. My first thought was a bear, but the spacing was too narrow, the marks too precise. And besides, bears don't just scratch around a cabin in the middle of the night without trying to break in. I spent the day on edge, checking my surroundings, looking for any sign of an animal or a person. I found nothing. No tracks, no signs of disturbance beyond the porch. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that settled deep in my stomach. That night, I barely slept. I kept the flashlight within reach, listening for any sound. Hours passed, and I started to convince myself it had been nothing, maybe just an animal passing through. But then, just past 2 a.m., I heard it again. This time, it was louder, The same slow dragging, but closer, right outside the door. My pulse hammered in my ears. I gripped the flashlight, debating whether to turn it on, but I was too afraid of what I might see. Then something brushed against the door. Not a knock, not a push, just a slow, deliberate press like someone was leaning against it. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the door, at the wooden latch holding it shut. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the pressure disappeared. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but eventually, exhaustion took me, and I slipped into a restless sleep. When morning came, I made my decision. I packed my gear, locked up the cabin, and started the long hike back to my car. Whatever had been outside my cabin, whatever had been watching me, it wasn't something I wanted to meet in daylight, let alone at night. As I reached my car and turned the engine over, I felt a lingering sense of unease, like I had left something unfinished. I told myself it was just my nerves, that I had let my imagination get the best of me. But as I pulled onto the main road, heading back towards civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left that cabin just in time. That if I had stayed one more night, whatever was out there wouldn't have just scratched the porch or pressed against the door. It would have come inside.